Hey guys, welcome back. My name's Tony and this is my mix breakdown video for the single Faith and Gold by I Need Mana. So the group I Need Mana is the brainchild of my good friend Clayton Brown. He's been recording his own music for a lot of years in his own home studio. This single was recorded mostly in his home studio. We've got programmed drums, live bass and guitars, and then we recorded vocals right here and did the whole mix right behind me. So I've got the mix loaded up on my Reaper-based system, so let's dive right in. Alright guys, so here's a quick rundown on how I've got my session laid out. I like to color code my tracks so you can just know what you're working on at a glance. So I've got my drums colored in blue, bass is in red, guitars are in green, synths are in purple, and the lead vocals and backup vocals are all just in gray. Throughout the drums in blue, any auxiliaries, reverb sends, or folders that I've added I've just kept as the standard Reaper gray color. Now you may have noticed that there's not a whole lot of actual audio files in some of these lanes. The way I've got this set up within Superior Drummer is that Superior will send the audio tracks to each of my tracks, so I don't have to have an actual audio folder there, and I don't have to use the Superior Drummer mixer. So when Clayton programmed all these drums, he did that on Easy Drummer at his home studio. I wanted to convert it to Superior Drummer because I prefer the sounds of Superior Drummer to the sounds of Easy Drummer. It was pretty straightforward to do the conversion. We just flew the MIDI into a Superior Drummer track and most of it was there. There was the occasional tom hit that ended up being a snare roll, you know, little things like that. So you do have to watch out when you're doing these kind of transfers, but all in all pretty straightforward. So generally the first thing that I work on with drums is the overheads. So here's a clip of the overheads with no processing on them, just as they were. So I mean, not bad. We're just using the standard Superior Drummer kit, NY Avatar I believe is what they call it. But it leaves a little something to be desired. So the first thing I did was put on an instance of Wave's SSL-G channel. I really enjoy SSL emulations because their EQ is just incredibly smooth. You have to try pretty hard on the high end to get it to sound harsh. So I wanted to add a little bit of high end to this overhead track, but not too much. So I think I've got a 2 decibel bump on the high shelf at almost 6K. Now that did end up being a little too much with everything else that was going on. So I've also got a low pass filter rolling off everything above 15 kilohertz. With that high end shelf, it started bringing out a little bit too much of the hi-hats. So I've got about a 2.6 decibel cut around 4K, pretty narrow, just to try and tame those hi-hats a little bit. I also wanted to add just a little bit more mid-range punch to it, so I've got a 5 decibel boost around 900 hertz. That just gives it a little bit extra honk in the mid-range, a little more punch. So I've added just a little bit of compression on this. I think only now and again does that first light on the bottom there blink, the 3 decibels, a gain reduction light. So it's at a ratio of 2, a threshold of around -10, and fast attack and a pretty quick release as well. So here's how that sounds with just the SSL on it. Here it is without. And with. So you notice right away that that high end sounds a little more controlled now, but you lose a bit of that snare punch coming through the mid-range. So I also added on, after the SSL channel, a Renaissance EQ. So I've boosted, again in the mid-range, about 850 hertz to almost 3 decibels. And I've cut a little bit more of that super high end, I believe it's almost 18K at 3 decibels. So here's how it sounds, just the SSL. And with the Renaissance equalizer. So that brings in a little bit more of that snare punch and tames that hi-hat in the high end just a little bit more. Now, I'm sure you can tell by looking around my room, but I'm a bit of an analog junkie. After the first time I did a project entirely on tape, I realized that tape saturation is what a lot of my productions have been missing. Personal preference, really. But the last thing I added onto this overhead track is a tape saturation plugin. So I use the Abbey Road Studios J37 tape plugin. I found I preferred this one to the Eddie Kramer tape plugin that they have, and I can't quite remember why, but this is the one I ended up buying. So I haven't done much to it. It's running at 50 nips at Formula 888, and I've got, let's see here, I've turned up the saturation knob to 3.2, set the in and out just so I can get a pretty healthy signal, and I haven't really done much else to it. So here's the overhead track without that on. And with. So that plugin helped just to breathe a little bit more life back into that overhead sound, which is something I love about tape, and even tape saturation plugins, is they help just make things sound a little more natural. So the last thing I did to this overhead track, and I think I did this a little later in the process, not while I was initially working on the overheads, is I added a bit of a plate reverb to it. It's just a really short, really in the background sort of plate reverb, and just to add another element of texture to it. So that is courtesy of Soundtoys' Little Plate plugin. I was lucky enough to get this for free when they first released it, and I tell you, if you can get it, do it. Fantastic plugin. Here's the overhead sound without the plate. And here it is with the plate. Mainly adds a little bit of depth to that snare drum. It's got a little bit more room to it. So after I got that overhead sound down, I probably would have moved on to the kick drum. So I've got Superior Drummer sending the kick drum to 2 different tracks, which I've replaced with my own samples. So I've got both my kick samples running into one kick drum folder, or a kick drum bus, and I'm processing them all the same. So without any processing on them, here's the sound of just the kick drums as just the kick drum samples. So the first thing I've done is I've run it through my Golden Age Project EQ73. I'm a big fan of 1073 EQs. I think they sound fantastic on everything. So I've got a boost happening at 55 Hz, that's your big low end on the kick, gotta have that. Another boost at 700 Hz, that gives it just a little bit of mid-range honk to kind of cut through a whole bunch of things and separate it from the bass a little bit. And then I've got another boost going on at 10K, that gives it a little bit of beater snap. So here's the kick drum sound without that hardware EQ. And with the hardware EQ. So after the hardware EQ, I've got Waves 1176 plugin designed by Chris Lord-Alge. I love this plugin because when you buy it, you really get 2 different compressors. You get their 1176 blue stripe, and you get their 1176 blackface. Most of the time I like the blue stripe on drums, but in this particular instance I'm going for the blackface. So I've got the ratio set at 4. I've got a very fast attack, as you can see, and a very quick release as well. You don't want the attack to be too fast because then you lose your transient, but if it's too slow, then the compressor doesn't really give the kick drum any snap at all. As for the release, it's kind of a quick sound, the kick drum, so you don't really want the compressor to be holding on to it for too long. So I've got this kick drum fairly slammed as far as compression goes. I think it's taking off about 7 decibels for each hit. Here's how it sounds. It's actually getting up to about 10 decibels in some of these hits. After the 1176 plugin, I decided I'd like to shape the transient a little bit more, so I included the Transient Monster plugin by Stillwell Audio, as well as the Reaper Stock Limiter, just to really slam that kick drum and bring it into your face. So here's how the kick drum sounds with all the processing on it. and without. That right there is a really good example of why you shouldn't be making your mix decisions with any track in solo. Personally, listening back to that right now, I preferred the sound of the kick drum without all the processing on it. But when you fly that into the mix with everything else, it just doesn't fit. Especially on a metal-styled mix like this, your kick drum can't have that big round low end, or else it's just going to mud up the works. So, like I said, my personal preference, this. Sounds a fair bit better than this. But when you throw that in the mix, I mean, that's the right sound right there. For the snare drum on this track, Clayton and I worked pretty hard at trying to get the sound we wanted out of EZdrummer. No matter what we did, it seemed like he liked the sound of the snare drum on his demos more than the snare drum we had here. So I just had him print off that snare drum sound and we flew it into this system. And I got him to bring those tracks over both with all the processing he did on the demo and without it. We ended up using all 4 of the tracks. So what we've got is 4 tracks of his snare drum samples. We've got 2 tracks of each, a USA Gretsch Custom and a John Tempest Signature. I didn't do a heck of a lot to these snare drum tracks to begin with. On each of the dry channels we've got about a 4 decibel shelving cut at 386 Hz. And on the snare bus I've got my trusty Transient Monster plugin from Stillwell Audio and another Renaissance EQ with a 3 decibel boost at about 300 Hz and a 1 decibel cut at about 8.4K. So here is just the snare samples as they were delivered to me. Now here's those snare samples once I took a little bit of the low end off of the dry signals. So on the snare folder I don't have a whole lot going on because most of the processing was already taken care of on Clayton's end of things. What I did add, however, is an instance of the Transient Monster plugin by Stillwell Audio, and a Renaissance EQ with a 3 decibel boost around 300 Hz and a 1 decibel cut around 8.4K. That just helped give the snare drum a little extra body while taking off a little of that top end sizzle. So here's the snare without any bus processing. And with. You can hear it just sounds like he's hitting the drum a little bit harder. It's got a little more punch to it, a little more oomph. But what you may have noticed is that there's no compressor on there yet. Now that's partially because I'm sure there was a compressor on it on Clayton's end, but I generally don't like directly compressing my snare drum. I'd much prefer to use a technique called parallel compression. If you haven't heard of parallel compression, the idea is, instead of stopping your audio signal from passing above a certain threshold, it takes all the audio signal from below a certain threshold and boosts it a little bit louder. The way we achieve this is by doubling our signal, so we've got 2 audio tracks essentially playing the same thing, and we very heavily compress one of the audio tracks. Now that on its own sounds like this. So I've got my CLA76 plugin taking off between 10 and 15 decibels whenever that snare really hits hard. I'm going to start playing just the snare drum without any of the parallel compression applied. And as I bring up the parallel compression channel, you'll hear the ghost notes and the quieter parts of the snare drum signal start to get a little more present. Without the parallel compressor, and with it. So I usually like using parallel compression on drums because it's a great way to not kill your transients. So the last thing I added onto this snare drum was a reverb. Clayton and I were referencing a periphery track for the drum sound, and we found that the snare drum reverb was quite dark sounding. So here's just the reverb channel on its own. So the first thing I did on my reverb channel was I put on a gentle gate. Now, I wasn't necessarily going for a gated reverb sound. What I was trying to do is make sure that the ghost notes didn't come through and affect the reverb too much, because that would end up with just a big, washy, messy reverb that would just gum up the mix. The main reverb duties are handled by Waves TrueVerb. We've got a fairly large sound going on. I brought down the early reflections a little bit. A decay time of 1.1 seconds, a pre-delay of 81.3 seconds. Last but not least, we've got an instance of Waves Renaissance Compressor. We've got that set as an optical compressor with 6 millisecond attack time, a 436 millisecond release time, really just to keep that reverb in check, to make sure the transient doesn't come on too high, the tail doesn't fade down too low. It just kind of squishes it down that little bit to make sure it stays nice and even. So here's just the reverb channel with no compressor on it. And with a compressor. You can see that the compressor really evens out the sound and just brings it more to the forefront. Here's the snare drum sound with all the processing that I added. So here's what we got so far with the overheads, kick drum, and snare. I have a hi-hat mic in this. It's muted most of the time, but all I really have on it is a Renaissance equalizer, taking off most of the high end, most of the low end, really just making it a MIDI honky kind of mess, just to blend in with the overhead signal. I mean, there's always going to be plenty of hi-hat in your overhead signal. So a hi-hat microphone is really only there to fill in the gaps that that sound leaves. So here's that hi-hat mic on its own. And here it is with the overheads. Without the hi-hat mic. And with it. So you can see it really is just there to fill in that mid-range that was lacking in the overhead mics. I definitely recommend taking and using hi-hat mics. Oftentimes I don't even use them in the mix, but I take them anyways just to be safe. So for both of these toms, I treated them just a little differently. My rack tom has a Renaissance EQ, a Renaissance compressor, and a transient monster on it. For the EQ, I've got a high-pass filter taking out everything below about 100 hertz, boosting 190 hertz by about 5 decibels to get, I guess 190 hertz was where I found was the main tone of that rack tom. I've got a cut around 500 hertz just to take out any excess mids. And I've got a 4 decibel boost at 7.2K just to bring in a little bit more of that stick contact on there. So after the EQ, I've got our Waves Renaissance compressor. I've got that set with a fairly fast attack time at 3.2 milliseconds just to really accentuate the snap on that tom. The release is quite a bit longer. That helps to drag out the tail of the tom. I messed around with the transient designer just a little bit to make sure we can bring out a little bit more of that snap, just to help it really cut through the mix. Here's the sound of the drum before any of my processing. and after. So you can see that there's quite a bit more snap on this drum. In a metal-styled mix like this, I always find the drums to be a little more snap than tone. So for the lower tom, I've got similar processing on it, except I've used two different plugins. Firstly, I used the Waves API 550A. That's a nice little 3-band EQ. I've got a 4 decibel boost at 100 Hertz. I've got a 2 decibel cut at 400 Hertz, and I've got a 2 decibel boost at 5K. After that, I've got my trusty DBX 160 plugin, also by Waves. I'm a bit of a Waves fan if you haven't noticed by now. Now the 160 is a pretty aggressive compressor. You can use that, you want to use that pretty sparingly. So I've got that set to take off about 5 decibels at a ratio of 3. And after that, once again, I've got a transient monster on there to really make sure we get a lot of snap out of that tom. So here's that low tom with no processing on it. And here it is with processing. You can hear we get a little bit of extra tail and a lot more snap and a nice low end, and a nice chunk of low end in there. So here's the two toms together. And here's the two toms with the rest of the drums. So some other tricks I'll use on toms is to send them both to a bus and put another 1176 on there to really make sure they stay level. Because these are sampled toms and because they're programmed to be level, I didn't bother with that, because if you can get away with not processing something, do it. There doesn't need to be a plugin on everything. There doesn't need to be a compressor on everything. Try to make sure when you're doing your mixing that you're really critically thinking about what each part of the puzzle does, because it's pretty easy to get bogged down with all the different tools at your disposal. Next, I would have started working on the room mics. Now I gave it a pretty typical rock and roll room mic treatment. First thing on the chain is another Renaissance EQ. I've got a high and low pass filter on it. High pass is at about 160 and the low pass is at about 8.6K. And then I've got a couple of dips in the mids, one at 2K, taking off 2 decibels, and one at 520 Hertz, taking off 2.6 decibels. After that, I've got another instance of Waves 1176 plugin. This time I went for the blue stripe. I've got it set for the all buttons in mode, a medium attack, and a fairly fast release. And then after that, my trusty J37 tape plugin, running at 15 IPS as well, Formula 811 this time. I turned up the saturation a little more than I usually do. This time it's at 6.9. I generally find with this plugin, about 2 on the saturation knob is enough, but I really wanted to mess this one up. So the goal with all that is to really just bring up the noise in the background. Take off all the transients, really just make it like a mushy, mid-rangey sort of mess. So you bring that in just a little bit into the overall drum track, and it just really helps add some energy to it. So here's how the room mic sounds with no processing whatsoever. And with the EQ, and I'll put the compressor on here. And the tape. So I'm going to take this right down to nothing, and we're going to slowly fade it in with the rest of the drum track. We've got nothing happening now. That's about the level we had it in the mix. So here's what happens if I mute that. And there it is back. for effect's sake, let's bring this up a little further. And muted. So you can see how it adds a little extra element of energy to the mix. So that brings us to the drum bus processing. Now for a rock mix like this, I usually like to add a little bit of parallel compression on there. In this case, a lot of parallel compression. So we've got an 1176 Blue Stripe by Waves on there. Medium attack, medium release, it's at a 12 ratio, and that sounds like this. That's taken off anywhere from 3 to 7 decibels per hit. So on the main drum bus, I've got my SSL G series bus compressor. So this one doesn't do much. I try to have it at a very slow attack. I've got it set at 10 milliseconds for the attack. Ratio of 2. Threshold, what would that say it's set at? 8.3. An automatic release. Really, I just want to have it taken off anywhere between, 1 and 2 decibels at the heavier spots of this song. It doesn't need to do much. After that, I've got a little bit of a dip. I've got a little bit of a high shelf, cutting 2.6 decibels off of 8K. So here's just the drum bus with no processing on it. And with processing. Now with parallel compression. So the last thing I'll mention is a little trick of mine that I like to use. Sometimes the crashes in your mix just don't have the impact that you'd like, or they just don't poke above the mix just like they should. So in that case, I like to add just a little bit of automation to them. So you can see on the screen that I'll put up here that there's a whole bunch of automation going on right underneath the overheads. So if you watch my fader port there, you'll see it twitch just a little bit at each cymbal shot. Just a few little extra things to add a bit of energy to your track. And last but not least, here's that section of song with everything else in the song.
Stars lit like lanterns without the curtain. The feeling's electric ripples, oceans wide. Sing like sirens with no reason to rhyme. Shining brightly, burn from a spark. Light up this home we left in the dark. These dreams were built on faith and gold.
Well, thank you for tuning in, guys. In my next video, we'll be going over bass guitar. If you have any thoughts, comments, suggestions, leave them in the comment box below. Please hit subscribe and the notification bell if you liked this video, and we'll see you again shortly.
Shining brightly, burn from a spark. Light up this home we left in the dark. These dreams were built on